I'm Anne Marie with the Heritage Area, coming back to you with Kevin Pawlak from Prince William County Historic Preservation Division, following up a little later in the morning on July 21st of 1861. Here we are at Henry Hill House. In 1861, this was known as Spring Hill, part of a farm complex, and it was owned by Judith Henry. She herself was an old woman at the time of the war, in her 80s. And one of the questions about war, when it finally came to this area, and all of a sudden came to this area, in addition to the troops deciding, feeling each other out, figuring out where the lines were going to occur, the civilians here also had to decide, are they going to stay or are they going to go? And history tells us that Judith herself did not want to leave. Her family convinced her somewhat willingly to leave the house. They got about halfway down the drive before the lines of artillery started showing up in her yard. So Judith went back inside, and can you finish that story for us, Kevin?
Yes, part of the reason that they had turned around is because if you come here to Henry Hill today, you'll see a plethora of Union artillery and Confederate artillery rolled up here. And just as they were trying to save Mrs. Henry's life, this artillery rolled up. A very close-range artillery duel ensued between the two sides, so they brought Mrs. Henry back there into her home. At one point, by one account, some Confederate soldiers had gotten into the house and were actually using it to fire on the horses and the men of one of these Union artillery batteries. So one of the Union guns was turned, fired directly into the house. A shell took off a part of Judith Henry's foot and struck her in the neck and the side as well. And so ultimately she would die from that wound. The rest of her family, her son, her daughter that were there with her, and one of her enslaved laborers by the name of Lucy Griffiths, incredibly survived. The house was basically just completely damaged by what had happened here on top of this hill, but Judith Henry became the only civilian to be killed on July 21st, 1861, though certainly not the only one to be caught up in the middle of all the crossfire that was going on.
Absolutely. Another very local resident here was actually Judith's half-brother, Jim Robinson, who lived at a separate farmstead not far here across the field. Now, at the time of the Civil War, Jim's house, his farm, was actually worth more than Judith's, which is especially interesting because history tells us that Jim himself was about half African-American. He was of mixed heritage, and so it's interesting to see a property owner here in the South, here on the lines of the battle, also encountering the same action that Judith did. There is also, of course, the Ben Lomond house, which is not far from here, home to the Pringles, and they themselves had a decision to make about whether to stay or leave. And their decision, though, came after the battle when their house was taken over to be a field hospital.
Yeah, and I just always think of how to people before these two armies converged on any landscape like this, that this was just somebody's regular farm, just known locally as Spring Hill. Of course, Manassas really wasn't much of a name in the American lexicon before, right? But now Henry Hill becomes one of the most famous landscapes in American military history, really. And Manassas becomes synonymous with bloodshed and the start of the war. And so, of course, people like Judith Henry, Jim Robinson, the Pringle family, they never asked for war to come here to make their farms famous, or well known, at least in the American psyche. But of course, the events that take place here on a day like July 21st, 1861 will make these places forever known in American history.
That's right. So we encourage you to come out and visit these sites for yourselves. There are plenty of historic sites affiliated with, of course, First Manassas that you can come see. When you come to the homestead, what you are seeing is a post-war reconstruction of the home. Of course, Judith's original home was only 1.5 stories, a much smaller residence than you see here today. But it gives you a great appreciation for the landscape, the resources, and what the people living here encountered in 1861.